As involving three separate entities: your brain, your mind, and you. The brain is a physical collection of organic matter that resides in your skull. Like other organs, it serves a variety of functions through a complex series of chemical and electrical interactions. A main function of the brain is to organize data, including thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations. The brain presents this data like a computer presents zeros and ones to a processor. The mind is that processor. It receives the data and acts on it. It filters it, promotes it, rejects it, and adds color and meaning to it. You are simply you. You are the one watching what the mind does with the data it receives. You are the witness, the observer of what the processor puts up on the computer monitor. Take a moment to drink this in. This concept is essential for developing mastery over OCD. You are the one who is aware of your thoughts. This is a completely different way of framing reality than believing that you are the content of the thoughts themselves. Most of us struggle to separate ourselves from the mind. If the mind seems busy analyzing the meaning of a thought, then it seems as if we are personally responsible for that analysis. Mindfulness is a concept grounded in the idea that you can observe what your mind is doing and decide for yourself how involved you want to be in the process. In his book, The Mindful Brain, Daniel Siegel describes the mind as a process that regulates the flow of energy and information. So, whether it's helpful for you to imagine the mind as part of the brain or as part of something more ethereal, consider that what we are most interested in is what it does, not what it is. What we are attempting to understand here is how the mind interacts with the OCD brain and with you, the OCD sufferer. The basic concept of mindfulness. Mindfulness is acknowledging and accepting whatever is happening in the present moment exactly as it is. Professor, author, and researcher Jon Kabat-Zinn defines it as the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose, in the present moment and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of experience. As a skill, it means developing the ability to notice what your mind is doing with the information it receives from the brain. This involves noticing individual acts of the mind, as well as patterns and tendencies of the mind. The practice of mindfulness for OCD is the cultivation of a relationship between you and your mind in which you cooperate with one another in your development of mastery over the disorder. The experience of OCD is feeling very much out of control of your mind. When you don't see yourself as separate from your mind, you may feel as if you are doing whatever your mind is doing. That means you not only are being asked to cope with the presence of intrusive thoughts that come with your OCD, but you also are taking on personal responsibility for how terrible they appear. It feels as if you are the malevolent generator of your unwanted ideas and the victim of them at the same time. You may attempt to pull the mind away from the unwanted thoughts by trying to convince yourself that your unwanted thoughts would never happen, that you're safe and it's okay for your mind to stop. But it doesn't work. The brain presents, the mind receives and acts, and you feel like a slave to the whole process. But if you develop the capacity to better observe what the mind is doing, you can begin to view the OCD thoughts as something different from their content. Because those of us with OCD so often find pain in OCD thoughts, we become accustomed to seeing our minds focused on judgment and rejection of what the brain offers. Rather than let the mind take in the thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations as they are, we fight. But it's the wrong fight. If you can choose to stay on the sidelines and observe what your mind receives and where it tends to go with it, you can begin to choose measured responses to your OCD thoughts. Instead of automatically reacting, you can begin to respond. To react to OCD is to jump into compulsions. To respond to OCD is to observe what your mind is doing and choose your next step. Let's address the giant Buddha statue in the room. Perhaps you have some apprehension about utilizing mindfulness because of associations it has with Buddhism. You do not have to be a Buddhist or subscribe to Buddhism to utilize and benefit from mindfulness. Roughly 2,500 years ago, a man named Siddhartha Gautama set out on a mission to better understand what it is to be human and to be conscious. He sat and observed his own mind until he concluded that we spend much of our time in a deluded state, following stories we tell ourselves and failing to wake up to the present moment reality. He became known as the enlightened or awakened one, the Buddha. He described human suffering as being caused by clinging too tightly to the desire that things be one way or another instead of observing them simply as they are. Sound familiar? If you have OCD, you know what it is like to suffer from an intense wish for certainty about your thoughts or a desire that they go away. Mindfulness, or sati, as it was called in his language of Pali, literally translated means remembering to be aware. Our failure to remember that thoughts are simply thoughts is how OCD so effectively commandeers our attention. Because we forget to be aware, we think and think without really knowing that what we are doing is thinking. We forget that we are really just sitting here, breathing, having bodies, hearing sounds, and so on, and we get trapped in these long and convoluted mental webs. So whatever religious practice or philosophical tradition you may subscribe to, if you subscribe to one at all, mindfulness does not require you to abandon your deeply held beliefs or take on Buddhist tenets. All we ask you to do is what the Buddha supposedly suggested we all do. Not to follow him or some new religion, but just to remember to show up to the present and see if that works out better for you than remaining lost in your OCD stories. In her book, Radical Acceptance, Tara Brach describes being lost in a trance of unworthiness and struggling with the story that something is fundamentally wrong with us. If you have OCD, your obsessions and compulsions are a reflection of this story. It tells you that you are not moral enough, not hygienic enough, not confident enough, not having good enough thoughts and feelings, and ultimately that you have not earned your self-worth. Nothing is actually wrong with you, but you are unaware that you are immersed in a narrative. Mindfulness is about waking up from that narrative. Staying in the present. If you've read mindfulness books or meditated, you've probably heard about staying in the present. At first, this may seem a bit silly, and you may think, how can I be anywhere but the present? I'm here right now. I'm here right now, completely freaking out because I think I may have touched something I wasn't supposed to an hour ago, which means that in a week or two, I'm going to find out I caught a disease. Right now is awful. But that isn't right now. That's your OCD's twisted version of right now. It is, in fact, the past, which no longer exists, and the future, which exists only in theory. In other words, it's the what if, not the what is, that OCD lives in. In the what is, there's nothing for the OCD to work with. You are just a person listening to a book, hearing words right now. Even thinking can be done in the present. Okay, you are a person thinking. There's nothing there for the OCD to get its claws into. However, the what if holds the fear of what might have happened or still what might happen. Then there's the urge to do something about that fear, to keep it from being realized. That is compulsion. Another way of looking at this is to consider that mindfulness is about keeping your mind close to your body. Your body is sitting in a chair listening to this book. Your mind is there with you, hearing these words. When your mind wanders off to replay a conversation you had last week or to think about an upcoming event, then your mind is nowhere near your body. In that space is where OCD presumes ownership of the mind. Can you think of a situation in which you often find your mind traveling to the past or the future instead of staying where you are in the present? Accepting what's going on right now being truly mindful doesn't necessarily mean feeling at peace. You may feel anxious right now. What is may mean that right now, where you sit, as you are, you don't know when or if your thoughts, feelings, and sensations will ever go away. Only in the present can you look at that without judgment and potentially experience it without fear. You may be your most grounded in a crisis. When the present moment is void of uncertainty and must be dealt with above all other things, the OCD often backs off. I see you're in the middle of something. I'll come back later to resume making you miserable, it says. Sometimes the crisis is very clear, like an earthquake or a car accident. Or sometimes smaller things in life seem to rise to crisis levels, like when you absolutely have to meet a book deadline and have no time for compulsions. This highlights how we tend to assume that our OCD is generally more important than the present moment, unless the present moment has something really extreme to offer. But why? Why, given our finite time on this planet, are we so willing to think, I'll listen to this music later, or I'll taste my food later, or I'll appreciate the sunset later, when I have the time? When will you have this time, if not now, in the present moment? To be mindful is to make the present moment the priority it really is, to choose to experience it fully, even the unwanted thoughts, as they are, right now, because there will never be another moment quite like this. Consider that your ability to be mindful, to lift up the present moment, may be a way to challenge OCD's lie about remaining distracted with obsessions and compulsions. Maybe if it can back off in a crisis, it can also back off in a moment just as important. In any moment, you are alive. Thoughts are thoughts, not threats. The primary difference between people with OCD and those without it is not the content of the thoughts, but their perspective on the thoughts. If your perspective is that a particular thought is bad in and of itself, then that thought may become problematic. A number of factors can influence how a thought becomes bad. When you're totally relaxed, a thought about snapping and doing something crazy may seem unworthy of attention, like junk mail. When you're anxious, that same thought may seem like a terrible indictment or a warning of a nightmare to come. If this is in my head, I have to get it out. If you can imagine your thoughts as a line of train cars, people with OCD and related disorders tend to keep stopping the train to make sure everyone has a ticket. Mindfulness asks that you simply observe the train as it passes. You're only at the station on your way to work. You don't have to involve yourself in ticketing and making sure the right people are on the right trains. This means acknowledging that unwanted thoughts are occurring, but not evaluating those thoughts as being particularly meaningful. Instead of changing what the thought means, you change your perspective toward the thought and how you process the fact that the thought occurs. It's not happening to you. It's simply happening. Thoughts as words. Another way of considering that thoughts are thoughts, not threats, is to look at how you view words. When you see a word, you call it the thing that it relates to. In his excellent workbook, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, Stephen Hayes describes how the mind is made up of a network of relational frames in which concepts are experienced internally as things they relate to. When you experience an OCD thought, you are also being made aware of all the things to which you relate that thought. For most thoughts, this doesn't trouble you. But for thoughts, feelings, and sensations that you associate with your disorder, you perceive the obsession as something of greater value than it really is. It's not just the obsession, but also all things that you associate with it. Practice. To notice how the mind works, picture this word. Mirror. Not the object, just the word. Ask yourself, what is this? Well, it's a mirror. Right, it's a mirror. However, if you stared at this word and tried to do your hair or makeup using it, we would consider this a bit odd. You don't see your reflection in the preceding mirror, so it's not a mirror, it's the word mirror. But is it the word mirror? Yes and no. We call it a word, but mirror is really a string of letters in a specific order that makes you think of a word that we relate to a reflective glass surface called a mirror. In a different order, it would just be a bunch of letters. MRRIOR doesn't mean much. And what are letters anyway? Just symbols, little drawings to which we've agreed to assign a certain value. This is an M, this is an R, and so forth. So a series of meaningless symbols is given meaning and then put in an order that adds to its meaning. This series of symbols is now called a word, and this word triggers an idea. The idea triggers images, in this case of a reflective surface, and all related thoughts, feelings, and sensations that accompany an awareness of being near a reflective surface. If you have OCD, experiencing an unwanted thought is as if you opened a book and an actual mirror fell out onto the floor. The thoughts are presented as having intrinsic value, automatic importance, and urgent relevance to some behavioral response. Mindfulness practice suggests that you view the thought in much the same way as you look at words. They are empty vessels that are given power after the mind organizes and considers them. The thought of being contaminated isn't the same as being contaminated. It's a thought of it. Feelings are feelings, not facts. Feelings are basically thoughts about physical sensations. You get a lump in your throat, tightness in your chest, sweaty palms, and dry mouth, and then you call it something. Guilt, for example. You say, "That means guilt. I am guilty." Then your OCD pushes you to explain the guilt rather than accept the sensation as it is. So you begin an endless journey of trying to figure out what crime you committed that could justify such guilt, until you eventually come up with something. But the relief is short-lived, because feelings are feelings. They are not facts. They are not fingerprints. They're just ideas about physical experiences. Like thoughts, they are born empty and are given meaning through behavior. If you live with OCD, you probably often wake up feeling guilty and spend your day investigating yourself and trying to find an appropriate sentence for the crime. Or maybe you just feel that something is off. What's the first feeling you become aware of when you wake up? OCD demands that you look at feelings, sort them out, and put them in a tidy box to be shipped off and destroyed. The OCD threatens you with the severest punishment of all, the idea that your feelings signify who you are, that guilt means you are a criminal, and that fear means you will be annihilated. The OCD says that these feelings are problems and that you must fix them or suffer. Mindfulness practice invites you to shrug your shoulders at the OCD and say, "Well, that's a feeling." Experience the feeling as a feeling, a thing that comes and goes in the body and provides little useful information about who you are or what you will do. Sensations are sensations, not mandates to act. The greatest mindfulness challenge for the OCD sufferer is to respond non-judgmentally to physical sensations. For the health anxiety sufferer, every pain is a sign of a serious illness and an indicator of supreme irresponsibility for allowing it to exist. For the person with sexual obsessions, every tingling sensation in the groin is viewed as proof of a deviant orientation or a predatory predisposition. So, physical sensations trigger feelings, which trigger thoughts, and they all converge in your mind like waves crashing on the shore. Mindfulness asks that you view physical sensations just as you see thoughts and feelings. They are experiences. Pain is pain, and we all agree that it feels bad. But if you let it feel bad and leave it at that, you maintain clarity. Clarity is what enables you to see the difference between a headache and a brain tumor. In other words, see physical sensations as what they are, and observe your urges to define them as what they could be. The spotlight. The problem with OCD isn't that you think too much. It's that you confuse the intensity, volume, or visibility of your thoughts with their importance. Look at the image above. It's a bookshelf. The books are all lined up, each with its own purpose and design, each full of information, facts, theories, memories, and stories. Yet at the end of the day, each is just a book. The books are different from one another, yet the same. Above the books is a spotlight. It shines down with a certain spectrum of light, brightly illuminating the books in the center, somewhat illuminating the books to either side of its beam, and leaving what may or may not be additional books obscured on both ends of the shelf. The brightly lit books in the middle are your regular everyday thoughts. You accept them at varying degrees of importance, but largely without any judgment. They are the thoughts that the sky is blue, that it's time to go to the bathroom, that pretzels are salty, and so forth. Whether or not you have OCD, you are aware of these types of thoughts, and they are regularly present in your consciousness. Where the spectrum of the spotlight fades at either end, we encounter more of our interesting thoughts. They may be interesting and desirable, or interesting and undesirable. You might think about getting a bonus at work on the left side of the spectrum, and about being audited by the IRS on the right side of the spectrum. These thoughts draw your interest when you are aware of them. These interesting thoughts may be exciting or upsetting. They may be the dark and creepy thoughts that we all have but don't admit to having. They may be the joyful and often juvenile thoughts that we also all have and rarely admit to having. The average person has these thoughts readily available, but must turn his attention toward them to take notice of them. Because these thoughts are only partially lit, they aren't presented in the mind in the same way that everyday thoughts are. Reviewing this graphic, you can see that farther out along the right side of the shelf are our undesirable fringe thoughts. This is where thoughts about death, extreme irresponsibility, peculiar sexual or aggressive notions, and so forth reside. The average person has these thoughts, but they appear far away and muffled as if underwater. If you ask someone to think of something disturbing, maybe for a creative writing project, she might dig in this shaded region to see what comes into her consciousness. If you tell someone to come up with a wacky idea for a birthday present or a pitch for a horror movie, this is where she will go in the mind to find them. These thoughts are more than interesting. They are out there. Past this dimly lit spectrum, there may still be many books to read, but the average non-OCD person is unaware of them. If he isn't being prompted to dig for these edgy, deep fringe thoughts, he might need to be reminded by something he saw on the news to bring them into present consciousness. Many people will claim not to have any of these thoughts. They'll say things like, "I've never thought of turning my wheel into oncoming traffic." But to say the words necessary for making this statement, you are, by default, having these thoughts. It's not that the non-OCD person doesn't have such thoughts. She does. She simply doesn't register her awareness of these thoughts as problematic. She doesn't ask why or when the thoughts are there, and thus doesn't process that they are even there or have any reason to remember that they were. Look at the graphic above. This is the OCD mind. Notice the range of the spotlight. The interesting and fringe thoughts are just as brightly lit as the everyday thoughts. They're not more meaningful, just more brightly lit. Here are some typical thoughts that may be lit up in the OCD mind, but are left obscured at the edge of the shelf in the non-OCD mind. The last person to touch this bathroom stall may have had a disease. I may have touched it, so I might now have a disease. I'm not disgusted by a man with his shirt off, so I could be so deep in the closet that even I don't know I'm gay. My not taking the fourth step on these stairs, but only the third one, will trigger a series of events that will end in the death of an innocent person. Mom will die if I don't say the word healthy right now. When I picked up my infant daughter, my hand touched her backside. I might be a child molester. I didn't pull the parking brake hard enough, so my car will roll away from the curb and hit a child. I've left the stove on, which will burn down the house. My cat will be burned alive. That kitchen knife is sharp. I could suddenly grab it and stab my husband. That pedestrian is no longer in my rearview mirror. I may have hit him with my car without noticing it. Thinking about my blinking will make me blink weirdly forever, and I'll go insane. In our experience, if you get more than a handful of OCD sufferers in a room, most of them will look at the previous list and acknowledge that at one point or another, they were aware of having some of these fringe thoughts. Maybe the thoughts never became full-fledged obsessions, but they presented themselves. And these people weren't trying to be clever. The thoughts just popped into their heads. Take a few moments to list some of your disturbing fringe thoughts here. They don't have to be related to your primary obsession. What thoughts emerge at the surface of your mind that you think belong far deeper down? Now, try the same with fringe thoughts from the positive side. These thoughts may be related to curing cancer, winning the lottery, you name it. Be a superhero. Let these thoughts be just as insane as the ugly, scary ones you obsess about. Notice how hard this is. We all tend to think of our positive fringe thoughts as silly and not worth much attention. What would the OCD experience be like if we applied the same emphasis on our negative fringe thoughts? Perhaps you wish you could narrow the spectrum of your spotlight, know less of what goes on in your mind. But this is missing an important point. Your desirable fringe thoughts are a huge part of who you are. That is why you have your sense of humor, why you fall in love so deeply with details others seem not to notice, why you appreciate music and art the way you do. What appears obvious to you does not appear obvious to everyone. We don't want to lose that by shrinking the spotlight. We want to learn how to work better with the spotlight so we can benefit from our positive fringe and not be so confused by the brightly lit thoughts in our negative fringe. To be mindful is to recognize that brightly lit thoughts are not more important just because they are more noticeable. After all, the volume of a person's voice doesn't correlate to the importance of what he says. The font size in the word mirror a few sections back didn't make the word any more like an actual mirror. The intensity of the thoughts, feelings, or sensations you experience need not correlate to their value.